started in just a minute here.
Right.
Slides look good.
Should I finish at 5:55?
So you have an hour, and so yeah, if you wanted to finish, so you would finish at 5 after, and so if you want to finish at 5 instead, then and leave yourself an extra 5 minutes for more discussion, that's up to you.
Sounds good. I'll try to do that.
Okay, great. And so I don't want to rob you of any of your time. So if anybody's joining us late, just remember that if you have a question, just unmute yourself and jump in, and we'll kind of handle this just like a regular seminar. Okay, Armen, go ahead.
Okay, so first off, thank you so much for providing us such great seminars every week, and also for including me in the program. I'm very excited to be here. This is my job market paper. It's joint with Shafat, who's my former classmate now at the World Bank. And the research is on inventories, input costs, and productivity gains from trade liberalizations. I want to say that Shafat is in the chat. You can ask there, but you can also just interrupt me as Kim was saying. Okay, so really at the heart of this research project lies the observation that firms that engage in international trade face a series of costs that are difficult to measure. And when firms change their supply chains and these costs respond, but their change is omitted, then this might lead to mismeasurement in the estimation of revenue-based productivity. For example, a lot of people think that in one of the long-run implications of the current pandemic is going to be that firms will diversify their supply chains and increase their inventory holdings. And this is likely going to increase their cost and hence make their products more expensive. Now, if we don't know by how much it has increased their costs, then we might incorrectly infer that their efficiency or markups have gone up. Okay. Now, in this paper, we contribute to addressing one of the most important questions in international trade, which is how much do economies gain from opening up to other countries. In particular, there's been robust finding that one of the most important channels of gains are through improvement in productivity of industry and firms. While some of these gains, or important fraction of these gains, are coming from the reallocation within firms, another important source is that within firm, productivity tends to rise. In particular, some of the largest effects have been found in response to reduction in input tariffs. And by input tariffs, I mean the tariffs that firms are actually paying on their inputs, as opposed to the tariffs that foreign firms need to pay in order to access the domestic market. So, for example, in their seminal paper, Omitted and Connings find that for importers, a 10% reduction in tariffs leads to a 12% increase in TFPR. Now let's put these numbers into perspective. So consider a firm that imports 50% of their goods, and that these goods make up for around 60% of their total expenditures. Then this 10% reduction in tariffs is going to lead to a direct cost reduction of 3%. Now, comparing these two numbers, a 12% increase in efficiency, 3% reduction in cost, it begs for the question, where are these gains coming from? Now, some of these gains might be justified through increased variety, increased quality, or maybe even some spurring of the innovation process. But at the end of the day, they cannot conclusively answer why did firms not access these low-hanging fruits before the trade liberalization actually occurred. Now, our papers might provide some insights into answering this question, because the point that we're making is that there are some additional costs of engaging in trade that are not observed. And if you don't account for those, you might estimate that the within firm productivity response to tariff reductions is much larger than it actually is. Now, let me briefly describe what we have in mind here. So really, the driving force of the mechanism that we have in mind is that we need to deflate output and input into production by using some imperfect proxy of firm level input costs or prices, in order to get closer to that measure of physical productivity. And what we usually do is we use wholesale price indexes. Now, the issue that we're raising here is that these wholesale price indexes are based on surveys of the price that firms are selling at. So if a firm is buying at that price, this price does not include all these additional costs, which it has to incur into getting those goods, which are the ordering costs or holding costs. Now, let me just quick reminder what holding costs of inventories are. These are costs associated with the foregone interest rates of having the goods in the warehouse, all the maintenance of the warehouse management, and all the costs associated with the depreciation of goods in the warehouse. And the point here is that these costs are much more important when it comes to sourcing goods internationally. And this is because goods that are sourced internationally tend to stay 2 to 3 times more time in the warehouse than those that are sourced domestically. Another way to say that is that firms order foreign goods more infrequently and in bigger sizes relative to those they source domestically. And this is just because of the nature of trade, which basically means that the ordering costs are higher, there's more shipping lags, there might be more uncertainty. Now, when firms switch to those foreign goods, and we only take into account that their purchase prices have gone down, and we don't account for these additional costs going up, then we might mistakenly infer that either their markup or their efficiency has gone up in response to that switch to foreign goods. Now, of course, the challenge here is that these costs are unobserved. However,
Rock Armen here. So are you able to suggest that if the input switching were to be from one foreign source to another foreign source, this will be a much lesser problem? So you made the case that the imports have a larger, say, insurance or warehouse expenses, but conditional on being an import from different sources, the variation may be actually much smaller.
Right.
Am I right? Or
yes, that's correct. I mean, the real distinction here that we're trying to make is domestic sourcing is very different from foreign sourcing, and there's going to be this premium associated, these additional costs from sourcing from abroad. What you usually observe is in the data, we usually don't observe the different sources that firms start buying from. We see, oh, their imports have gone up, the productivity has gone up, and it would be very interesting to see what happens in that case. I mean, of course, there is some heterogeneity. Of course, if I'm buying from Mexico, it's not the same as if I'm buying from China. So probably because China is more far away, I'm going to hold more inventories. So there might be some changes there too. But for the sake of this talk today, let's just keep it simple and think of domestic versus foreign.
Thanks.
I would like to know that actually, and it would be great to know in the data if we could look at something like that. Great. So yeah, so these costs might be unobserved, but they're very tightly linked to observables that we see in the data, which is the inventory usage and the input intensity of firms. Then we can use this information of these proxy variables and include them as a control function of the input cost in the TFPR estimation. And now, before I go into the grains of this, let me just show you why these costs are more important for firms that are more engaged in international trade. So this table takes data from Indian manufacturing firms from the Prowess survey that we will later use to estimate productivity. And here I'm classifying these firms according to their distribution of the import intensity. And you see that in the lower end of the distribution, firms hold on average 0.26 and an inventory usage ratio of 0.26. But as you move to the upper end of the distribution, the inventory usage ratio almost doubles. Now, the inventory usage ratio here is defined as the monthly value of inventories over the annual consumption of materials. So if you multiply this by 12, you will get the monthly inventory usage ratio, which is the number that we're probably more familiar with. And multiplying this by 12, you see that this ranges between 3 and 6, which is relatively high if we compare it to what we are used to from the US, where this is between 1.5 and 3 maybe. Now, this is something that's been documented previously in developing countries. inventory holdings tend to be much larger. Okay, so now how important is that for total cost of a firm? So let's just assume for simplicity that the annual value of the fraction of holding costs are around 40% of the value of inventories. And this is kind of in the ballpark of what people estimate to be. Usually in developing countries, these numbers are higher because interest rates tend to be larger, but let's just take that number. And then in order to assess how important they are for the firm over all its costs, we need to multiply that by the material expenditure share and the amount of time that inventories, that goods are staying in the warehouse. So this is the inventory usage ratio. So basically we're going to multiply 40 times these inventory usage ratio times the material share. And not surprisingly, we find that for firms that don't hold a lot of inventories or hold it for less amount of time, these holding costs are much smaller than for firms that hold a lot of inventories. So the holding cost almost doubles. Now here, this is just here I'm making a simple assumption of setting this equal to 40%. Arguably, these costs are heterogeneous. They might not be linear. In our estimation, we will not take a stand on the particular form of the holding costs. Okay, big question. How does that affect?
Armen, real quick on that last comment you just made. They're heterogeneous like across firms, or what do you? Is that? Yeah, I was about to ask you about the selection in this table. That just there may be firms that, or there may be goods or industries or things where it's not that expensive to hold industries. It's like cement blocks. I can just leave them sitting outside. It's not that tough. Whereas if it's, I'm importing cabbage or lettuce or something like that, I got to keep it chilled, and even then, like my lettuce goes bad in my refrigerator after a couple of days. Like, what is that? What you're going to do? Is that sort of the approach you're going to take?
So the approach that so absolutely, you're right. Later on, I will show you more sophisticated econometric regression work where we're showing that the fact that we really require here is that as firms switch towards foreign sources, these inventories tend to go up, whatever sector. Now, how expensive how costly they are, that's something that we won't be able to pin down.
Okay, sounds good. I'll wait for the econometrics.
Okay, great. So in order to assess how important, yeah.
One question. Do you know whether these are directly imported intermediate inputs by these firms, or these are just foreign inputs that they obtained possibly indirectly?
So that's a great question. So this also allows me to talk about the sample that we're using. We're using a survey of firms by prowess, and these are big firms, and around 70% of them are actually importers, which is not what we would get in the census. And we don't know if the firms that we observe that are not importing are actually importing through other channels. And I conjecture that's actually the fact, because we do get some results that make us think that this might be going on in the data. But to answer your question, these are direct imports. Okay, quick back of the envelope calculation for how this might affect the elasticity of TFPR to tariffs. Suppose that input tariffs go down by 10% and that the inventory usage ratio goes from 0.25 to 0.45. Now, making the same calculation I did previously, we would consider that the holding cost is going up by 5%. Now, if we estimated the TFPR elasticity to input tariffs to be minus 1.2, then the TFPR gain is 12%. But if we didn't account for this 5% additional cost, then we would obtain it. Then there would be an upward bias in the elasticity of around 40%. Now, this is precisely what the paper is about. I'm going to go about this in a much more sophisticated and detailed way. But what we do and what we find in the paper is first place, we study the behavior of inventories during India's trade liberalization. And what we find is that for a firm that imports all of its inputs versus a firm that imports none of its inputs, the inventory usage ratio is almost 3 times larger. And similarly, there's a direct link between input tariffs and the inventory usage ratio, and that elasticity is around 5. Now, we illustrate that these costs that are coming from holding inventories might lead to biases in the estimation of productivity. And we propose a correction method that basically implements a control function in that estimation. When we do
Armen,
that,
I have a question. Exactly the bias is on the elasticity or on the welfare/efficiency gains?
right. So it's in the elasticity. So we will not make any. We will not write down a model in where we take this and make an assessment of the welfare implications of this. So this is a bias that comes from not taking into account that as firms switch towards foreign sources, they incur more costs. And that's simply addressing the literature that has highlighted these large responses, the large elasticity. I don't know if that answers.
There's a part that I don't understand in the sense the response is in the data. The elasticity of the import share to the input tariff, that has a bias. That's still there. Of the import share, or I guess that the effect that it has on TFP is different story. But the elasticity to the import share, that is not biased. That is what it is. Or am I wrong?
Right. So the issue is about measuring productivity correctly. So productivity is a quantity-based measure, and so we ideally want to purge away all the valuation aspects of it. And there is an important ingredient in that valuation that is very difficult to measure. So once we purge that away, and we get an elasticity, that is different from what people have been reporting without taking into account this mechanism.
Thank you.
Maybe we can talk about later. All right. So what happens when we control for these unobserved costs by introducing the control function? So what we find is that the elasticity drops by around 20 to 50% and 37% in the baseline. And this bias is much more important for firms and industries that are inventory intensive. Moreover, when we look at the dynamic path of the productivity response to the tariff reductions, we see that it's exactly at the same time that the firm adjusts its trade and inventory levels to the trade liberalization that these productivity biases matter. And finally, we also write down a model that captures the essence of this measurement, where firms can choose whether to source from home or abroad, and there's an inventory premium associated. And we use this model simulations of the model in order to validate our control function approach. Okay, so I'm not going to make justice to all the previous work that we rely on. I do want to highlight that what we're contributing here is by accommodating the fact that there is an inventory premium of importers, and that matters in the estimation of in the literature for empirical gains from trade. And when you do accommodate for this, you see that the within firm productivity gains are smaller than what has been previously reported by a bunch of other papers. Now, the inventory premium has been documented previously too. George has laid the grounds for work that has followed and has shown that this premium can explain many aspects of international trade. What we're showing in this paper is that the premium is also consequential for understanding the productivity response to trade shocks. All right, so in the next 30 so minutes, I will try to talk about a model that captures these additional costs that we think are very important in international trade, and then I will show how to incorporate these costs into the standard procedure of estimating productivity, and then we'll apply that and see that it's pretty relevant for the elasticity of productivity to tariffs. Great. So this simple SS ordering model, this is really, I just looked at this up, and this model is more than 100 years old, and it's fairly simple, but it serves a purpose here because it allows us to get a simple expression for what the cost is that a firm actually pays when there's additional cost of purchasing a good. So for simplicity, the model takes demand for an input to be constant, and then on top of the unit cost of buying that good, the firm has to pay some additional sourcing costs, which is every time it orders, it has to pay kappa, and then once it has this good in the warehouse, there's these holding costs, CH. So it's trading off and not ordering too often so that it avoids paying kappa, but at the same time, if it doesn't order sufficient, a lot of holding costs. So this is going to be resulting in a standard SS ordering behavior where the firm basically runs down its inventories and then fills up the warehouse again. As I said earlier, we have a more complicated, extended version of this, but this really captures the essence of what we have in mind, where the firm is ordering, running down inventories, ordering again, and what the nice thing about the model is it gives us it provides the average level of inventories, which is simply going to be this Z, which is the amount it orders every time, over 2. So as I said, we can use this model in order to write down an expression of the material cost. And for that purpose, we will distinguish 2 inputs whose demand is independent, a good that is called D for domestic and F for foreign. And we will also fix the amount it purchases from abroad to be constant and denoted by this NZ term. So the total cost that the firm is paying is going to be defined by the following components. So on the one hand, it's paying the unit cost of the domestic good times the quantity it's buying of the domestic good, and the same for the foreign good. So these are the variable costs of buying. Then there's the ordering cost, which is, as I said, this kappa, which is every time it orders, it has to pay this. Now, how often does it order? Well, the average amount of orders is going to be the total amount of purchase consumption of that good over the purchase quantity it does every time it orders. So this is just the average amount of orders times the cost of each order, and we have the same term for the foreign input. And then in addition to this, there's these holding costs, which is basically just the amount that it costs to hold these inventories times the average level of inventories held. Now, after some algebra, we get this expression, which for the average material cost, which is just the total cost divided by the total consumption, which is a weighted average of the unit cost. And this additional term here, which is, and this is really the departure of what the standard approach is to valuing material usage. And this includes here an expression that is multiplying the holding cost times the inventory usage ratio. Okay, once I convinced you that this is a...
So hang on, hold on, Armen, real quick, just looking ahead. Sorry, I guess I should be able to see this from the cost function, but these goods, these 2 different inputs are substitutable for each other. They're in fixed proportions. I got a little lost about what these different inputs are supposed to be.
So yeah, you should think of this as being Leontief. So their demands are these demands are independent. So yeah, we're not taking a stand here on how substitutable they are.
I thought the story you were telling me, I thought the story we were talking about at the beginning was I switch from buying domestically to buying foreign, and that induces, is that still what's going to happen?
So in the model that we write down later on, which I don't want to show you today, we have this mechanism where you're substituting towards that good. Here, all I want to show you is really that what I wanted to take away here is that the average material cost depends on these holding costs, and that they are a function of the inventory usage ratio. And this same is going to hold in a more complicated model that you're thinking of, but it doesn't give you this analytical solution.
So just to follow on that, are you in the top equation, is anything being optimized over when we go to the bottom one?
Yes, we're optimizing we're optimizing, excuse me, the Z.
The Z, but the M is fixed.
the M over Z is fixed. I'm just fixing this here for simplicity. And obviously, in a more complicated model that Kim is thinking of, this is not fixed, and this depends on the substitution between the two goods.
And the S now is part of that optimization.
And now, exactly right, because in this model, the average inventory holding is equal to Z over 2. And this is just because the demand is constant and it's linearly depleted.
Okay.
Okay, now, hopefully I've convinced you that even though this is a simple version of how average cost looks, it's still a more realistic one than just assuming that firms only pay the purchase price. And what we're saying here is that in addition to the purchase price, there's other additional costs. And now I want to show you how we can account for them when we estimate productivity. So let's just assume that the firm's production technology is Cobb-Douglas, and it produces output Y with labor, capital, and material usage and materials, and these are all physical quantities, so that A, the physical efficiency, is the term that we're after. Now, the point that we're making is that when a firm buys and using a deflator reflects only the buying price of a firm. So it only reflects so that its price, that when proxying its price with those wholesale price indexes, we're only taking into account the purchase price. But in fact, firms, when they set their prices, they do take into account these additional costs, so that the price that the firm sets is going to be some proportion of these purchase price and the additional costs that we're referring to with the EOQ model. So when we deflate revenues with this wholesale price index, what we're obtaining is really the physical output plus this additional term here, which is the difference between the firm's true input costs and the input cost proxies by purchase prices from the wholesale price index. So when we estimate,
I have a clarifying question here. When you were empirically, when you were doing the right hand side, what do you exactly see in the data? Usually, when people do this, they use the reported intermediate expenditure and divide them by the so-called output deflator there, right?
Right.
The question is whether that measure already include what you want in terms of the conceptual inventory cost or not. Are these reported or not?
Right. So wholesale price indexes are ex-factory gate prices, and so they do not. Once the firm buys that good at this wholesale price index, that's when it starts. It does not include the cost that the firm incurred in buying it, the ordering costs, and it does not include that once it receives those goods and it's in the warehouse, it incurs those holding costs. So these are the two precise costs that are not included in the wholesale price index, because those are ex-factory gate prices.
No, I'm not talking about denominator. I'm talking about the numerator. I'm totally on board with the denominator is problematic. But the question is, if you were thinking about the numerator, what were people were deflating towards? Does that include the inventory costs usually?
And you mean what do you mean by the numerator?
Because you are trying to get QIT, right?
Right.
Yeah. So your point is that the PIT, the typical use PJT is not accurate. We want to use CJT.
Yeah. So I see what you're saying.
But I've been wondering, So you have the numerator term there, but the question is whether your numerator indeed include the inventory cost or not.
Yeah, this is a great point. So this is a data point that we don't have, and I would argue that it's natural that firms price include these costs in when they set their prices. So whatever structure of demand of competition you have in mind, I would say that this is going to go into the cost that they consider when they charge their prices. That's an assumption that we have to go with in going forward. All right, so once you consider that firms are actually pricing by taking that into account, this term here on the right-hand side pops up. And this is the omitted variable that we're trying to make the case that is very important. Because when you estimate using these deflated revenues, you will not obtain A. You will obtain the estimated residual is going to be the sum of the two, which is potentially going to lead to two biases. One is that this is a more trivial one, and the purchase prices might be different across firms. But then, really, the more interesting one and the more novel one that we're pointing to is that because these holding costs are non-zero, the heterogeneity in inventory management and in the inventory usage ratio also matters. And both of these sources of bias are very related to the firm's importing behavior and by extension to how they respond to input tariffs. Now, I just want to side note here that here we are taking the approach of including materials on the right-hand side. The same issue would remain if we considered value added in the TFPR estimation. Okay, so how do we work around this issue? So naturally, as I was saying, these are unobserved, but the EOQ model showed us that they are very much related to, one, the inventory usage ratio, and second, the import intensity of the firm. So what we can do is we can write down the same production function and proxy for the unobserved costs by using a polynomial expansion of these two variables. What's going to happen is that we'll have these additional parameters that we will need to delta, which we will need to identify. And I will be more specific about this. And as you've noticed throughout my talk, I've been abstracting from the distinction between physical efficiency and markups. And yeah. Okay, so from here, we will just try to implement a standard or the most up-to-date approach in the literature, which borrows from the inside of the control function approach from Olean Paix and Levinson Petrin. And that, that the first insight is that the TFPA is going to be split into two terms, the productivity that the firm responds to when it decides its inputs, and epsilon, which is a shock that occurs after the firm has decided its inputs. Now, the basic insight of the approach is that once we assume that material demand is strictly increasing in the productivity term that the firm considers when buying its inputs, and that this productivity term is a scalar, then we can write down the import demand equation. Sorry, not the import, the material demand equation as Q as a function of this omega, and we can invert it in order to obtain an expression of this productivity that the firm uses when it buys its goods. And we're going to express this as a function h. Now we will assume in our baseline, we will assume that this dot here stands for other state variables, and we will assume that not only capital is a state variable, but also labor is a state variable because there's some frictions in adjusting your labor. So once the productivity shock occurs, you can adjust your materials, but you can't adjust your labor immediately. We will have some robustness checks on that. Now, on top of that, the firm, according to our framework, the firm will also consider these additional ordering holding costs. So we need to include these proxy variables in the H function. So in the first stage, what we're going to do is we will proxy this H function that again, it proxies the productivity term that the firm uses in order to decide its purchases using a third order polynomial. And when we then plug that into the production function, we have this H here. Now, in the first stage, we're just going to estimate this equation by having a third order polynomial expansion of all the arguments in this equation. And obviously, we cannot identify any parameter here. And all the parameters are going to be identified in the second stage. Now, the identification in the second stage is going to be based on the following. We will assume that productivity, the productivity observed by the firm, will follow an AR1 process, which is described by this function G. And then on top of the terms that describe the evolution of the productivity, there's going to be a productivity innovation. And that's crucial in order to pin down the identification of the parameters. In our G function, we will include lagged values of productivity, and the literature has taught us that we should also include other variables that might determine productivity, so input and output errors and lagged exporter status. So the identification is going to be based on this productivity innovation term, and we will argue, we will take the stand that this innovation process is unrelated to the current level of capital, the current level of labor, and lagged values of materials. Now, this is pretty much standard. What is new is that we also need to identify the parameters of the control function. So our identification is going to take the stand that, we think that input intensity is actually going to respond to productivity contemporaneously, so we can't use that. But there's no reason to believe that it's correlated with past input intensity. Similarly, contemporaneously, the inventory usage ratio should respond to contemporaneous productivity shocks. You might think that if you have a very high demand level, you want to use that and sell all the inventories, or if you have or you might use that to produce a lot because you're so productive this year. So contemporaneous inventory usage ratio might not be a good choice, but the lagged one should be pretty good. And then the identification is just going to come from the orthogonality condition of this innovation process and these terms here. Now, there's criticism to this approach, which from Gandhi et al. I think I'm going to skip this, and maybe if someone wants to talk about it, we can talk about it later. So how is the estimation going to proceed? So the first thing that we do is we're going to make a guess on all the parameters, which is going to come from an OLS, and then we'll estimate by making that guess and taking the predicted revenue from the first stage, we can then pin down what is the productivity shock in each period. Once we have the predicted productivity shock, we can then run a regression as the one assumed by the AR1 process, and we will take the following parameterization where we basically assume that the G function is linear in all its terms. And then we will be able to estimate this productivity innovation, and that's when we can then apply the sample moments of the identification strategy. So basically what we're going to do, we're going to estimate the parameters of the production function, including the ones of our input cost function that minimizes the sum of squared residual of the sample moments. Because we're estimating in two stages, we need to block bootstrap, and then we will set the parameters to be equal to the mean of the repetitions. Finally, once we have those, we can then provide the productivity estimate as the difference between the observed deflated revenues and the predicted by those parameters. Okay, I'm going to make some remarks here. So this procedure that I've shown you is quite standard and important. Yeah, people in this literature have used this approach. I've pointed to that criticism by the Gandhi-Navarro-Rivers paper, and we depart a little bit from these previous works in the sense that in the proxy function of productivity, we do allow for more variation in order to accommodate this criticism. Again, we can talk about this later. And then we borrow the optimization procedure from ACF, and then really this idea of having a control function on the right-hand side of the production function estimation has been used previously by DeLucker et al. But they have a completely different bias in mind than the one that we have in mind, and the variables that they use in that control functions are different to ours. And I also want to say that, we as I said earlier, we simulate the model that incorporates these mechanism and this mismeasurement bias, and validate our control function approach. Alternatively, we could use that model and estimate it, but so far we've gone down the road of just validating our empirical approach, since this literature is quite applied in nature. Okay, so I think I have only around 10 minutes left. Let me go into the results of applying this methodology. So the Indian trade liberalization has been used widely in the literature on firm performance and trade. And India's trade barriers were really large in the 1970s and 80s. So we're talking about tariffs of around 90%, something that we're not used to these days anymore. And the reason that India underwent a strong trade liberalization is because it went into it had accumulated large deficits and then had to go to the IMF in order to ask for a rescue package. And one of the conditions the IMF imposed was that you need to open your markets to foreign countries. So there was a drastic reduction in input and output in tariffs in general, in its mean, but also in the dispersion around it. Now, the fact that this was relatively forced upon India has led some people to argue that this was relatively exogenous across industries.
Armen, can I ask a question? I think this seems like the right place to ask it. This is mostly about my ignorance of how econometrics works, but you're going to look at a pretty big liberalization here. Is the stuff that you've done, all the kind of work you've shown us so far, is that kind of able to handle kind of big nonlinear changes in things? So if I go from not importing at all to importing 100%, or not buying anything foreign, does that cause any problems with your identification strategies?
I would say no. I think that our approach is pretty much flexible, but I do need to think about that a little bit, and maybe you can tell me later what you have in mind, what could cause some problems.
Okay.
All right, so the data we're using is pretty much the standard that other papers have used to study this episode. As I said earlier, it's a survey of manufacturing firms, and that includes profit and loss and balance sheet information. The main ingredients that we're using and that others haven't used are inventories of raw materials that are going to be our proxy for the amount of inventories that firm hold of their inputs. And it also provides information on the import of raw materials. We will borrow the tariff from Topalova and Khanewal. So overall, we will focus on because we estimate the production functions at a 2-digit industry level, we will focus on those industries that have more observations so that we can see and get precise estimates. Great. All right. So the trade liberalization was the following. So in 1990, the median input tariff was above 30%, and then in 2001 it went down to around 14%. You can see also that there's now less dispersion, as I was saying earlier. And people argue that this is kind of exogenously implemented precisely because of the reason that the size of the input tariff reduction, which is the y-axis here, is very well predicted by what is the x-axis, which is the level of tariffs in 1990. Great. So again, I want to show you that inventories responded strongly here. So the way I'm going to go about this is by having the inventory usage ratio on the left-hand side, and then I'm going to include a bunch of proxies, first for trade. Basically, DRM is going to be a dummy for whether the firm imports, and then the import intensity is going to be MZ. And then I'm also going to include the direct measures of trade policy, namely the input and the output tariffs. I will control for the size of firms by having the total consumption of materials here. This is very important because the inventory usage ratio tends to go down as firms become bigger, and that's something that is actually predicted by the EOQ model too. And then I'll have some additional controls, and I will impose sector year fixed effects so that all the variation is coming by comparing firms of the same size and comparing whether they import more or less. Okay, and then the identification of the trade policy is going to come from having these tariffs at a more disaggregate level than the 2-digit industry. Great. So here I'm plotting this table where I have the inventory usage ratio, and then as we move from one column to the other, I'm including more and more variables. And in column 5, I have the specification that I just showed you here. So as you can see, an importer has higher inventory usage ratio than non-importers, and that is also, and it's also increasing in the continuous measure of import intensity. Now, on the other hand, as input tariffs go down, the inventory usage goes up too. Now, this is a direct measure. It might be a little more surprising, and I think that is something that is a little bit related to what Felix was saying, is that, you know, there might be some indirect channels or input-output channels operating, so that even though a firm is not directly importing, because it's buying now foreign goods from an intermediary, it's also accumulating those inventories. Okay. So we do a bunch of,
sorry,
yeah.
just really useful to understand your model. So here, above and beyond the import intensity, what's the additional channel that the input tariffs been generating changes in the left-hand side variable? I'm just trying to understand the mechanism.
Right. Yeah. So this is, you know, this is what I was saying, that there might be, so in this sample, there is generally big firms only. So you could think that even though these big firms are not buying foreign goods directly, they might be buying them indirectly. So when their suppliers buy these large amounts of goods, some of that might go over into them also accumulating those inventories. That's the story that I can come up with. So we've run these same regressions for Indonesia. We do find that the tariff channel is weaker. And for Indonesia, we have a census where there's lots of smaller firms. So this might be driven a little bit by the sample that we're using here.
Yeah, I find it a little bit somewhat related to your control function approach, because that's a fairly tight assumption there. What you really need is to map. You need a very strong monotonicity, that you need the import intensity to summarizing whatever the fundamental drive force of your of your cost, right? And now that you're almost like shooting yourself in the foot, in the sense like you're saying, oh, there's a secondary source, so that this mapping is not, you know, that brings the question about the monotonicity assumption in your control function approach. So I think that might be something worth thinking a little bit.
Okay, thank you for your point. All right, this result that I've just shown you holds under different specifications, and the main takeaway here is that, you know, in a more serious regression analysis, this fact that importing firms hold larger inventories tends to hold is pretty notorious. So which is kind of a good hint to illustrating that these biases from additional costs might actually be operating here. So now let's estimate our main result, which is on the productivity effects of these input tariffs. So what I'm going to do is I will estimate TFPR the way I just showed you, and I will include or not the control function. And then I will estimate, then I will run an regression where I regress this productivity on lagged input tariffs and lagged output tariffs, and firm level fixed effects and time fixed effects. Now, the fact that we're including firm fixed effects basically says that you're comparing one firm over time. And then we're taking, and then in the coefficient is going to be, this should say lambda, will identify the correlation of the average TFP growth across all firms given that changes apply. Okay, so what we find is, you know, when we don't include the control, we get an elasticity of 1, which is sort of similar to what people have found. then here we're only including import intensity and it drops. Here we're only including inventory usage alone and it drops. But then once we include both, the drop is much more significant. And when we implement our baseline, where the input costs are proxied by a polynomial of the two variables, the drop is quite significant and around 37%. Okay, now, obviously we've taken a lot of assumptions along the way, and we want to make sure that none of these are essential to the results that we're reporting here. So, you know, I've mentioned earlier that we could specify age to be a little different. We could also specify the H is, again, that's the proxy function of productivity. This is the productivity process. We can include energy in the production function. We could specify production function to be translog. We can assign these additional costs to be reflecting all input factors of productions. We could also identify a labor in the first stage, or change the moment condition of labor. My favorite one is when we take a different price index to deflate variables, and then, you know, we also check some because our sample isn't really good at representing all firms, and we look at the balance or something of a balanced sample, and all of these specifications don't really change our conclusion, which is that the drop in the elasticity tends to be around 36%. Okay, so yeah, I'm really running out of time, and I want to, you know, I think that what we're capturing is really related to the bias, and maybe this addresses a little bit of Daniel's concerns. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the bias differs across different firms, and we do that by classifying firms into terciles of the distribution of the inventory usage ratio within a 2-digit sector year, and by terciles of the distribution of the inventory usage ratio in 1990. And then basically we're just going to have that dummy variable multiplying the elasticity that we estimated previously for the average. And what we see is that, you know, and of course we need to get rid of the firm fixed effects because we are classifying firms into bids, and these are firm fixed effects. So when we take away the firm fixed effects, we see that the bias goes up a little bit, or significantly actually. But what we want to highlight here is that it is those firms within an industry that have more inventories that are really driving this result. And it is the industries that were really intensive in inventories in 1990, just at the outset of the trade liberalization, that are again driving this result. Okay, so finally, we also want to look at the dynamic path of how our measure of productivity differs to that if you don't control for it. What we do that because we know our story is very much linked to the fact that firms start sourcing from abroad. So ideally, the moment that they start sourcing from abroad should coincide with the mismeasurement of these costs. So what we're going to do is we're just going to estimate a dynamic equation. And first, we're going to look at trade and at inventories. And let me just show you the graphs that reflect this. Here you have this dynamic elasticity of trade. So basically, I'm regressing the import intensity on the change in tariffs. And what we see is, you know, this is a little imprecise. This is because we're using balance sheet information. We're not using disaggregate trade data. But we do see a pattern that is quite similar to what we see in the actual trade data, and to something that Shafat and I have documented in previous work, is that these adjustments are really gradual and they take at least 3 years to unfold. And a similar pattern is true for the inventory usage ratio. We see that the elasticity doesn't really settle until its 4th year. So when we do the same exercise for productivity, we see that, you know, our measure is the blue one, and the one that doesn't control is the red one. We see that our measure really starts departing from the measure that doesn't control after the 3rd and 4th year. And then it settles at a lower level. And I've talked about Indonesia previously. We've done the same exercise for Indonesia, and we see that something similar is going on here. Okay, so let me conclude here. So what we're trying to argue here is that when firms change their sourcing behavior, using aggregate price indexes are not capturing well the heterogeneous response and might be ill-suited to reflect the response to shocks or policy. What we're trying to do is we're trying to bring in some more information to more accurately estimate the response productivity. And we think that this approach might also be important to better understand, if markups are responding in those episodes, or if it's true efficiency. We also think that this control approach should be taken seriously in other occasions, such as when there are large devaluations. It's been reported that productivity tend to go to go down importantly. Over the business cycle, we're seeing currently that inventory levels are rising importantly in response to the COVID shock. So and we want to know how firms' performance actually is affected by those things. So we need to take these things into account. Okay, so let me finish on this note. And yeah, thank you so much for your time and attention and questions.
Okay, so we'll open up the floor to questions or comments.
I couldn't understand.
I don't think that's a question. I think that's so I'll ask a question though. So in some ways, maybe, I don't know if this is an underestimation, but you don't have any sort of like switching costs between suppliers, right? So the idea that you're saying like the only difference between buying internationally and buying domestically is that the ordering cost is bigger and the holding cost might be different. But to the extent that there's these other costs that either keep people from making this switch or not, I don't know, I'm not quite sure how to think about it, but is that are you somehow capturing those kinds of changes too?
No, I don't think we're capturing that, but that actually allowed me to talk about this bullet points that I didn't talk about. Yeah, I think that you're saying, there's other costs that might actually be also relevant, and we also don't have a good grasp on them. And yeah, I don't think we're capturing these type of switching costs, but they might actually also be operating and driving these elasticities.
And I guess my other question is then, where are you dealing with like differences in quality? Presumably you're getting the international stuff because it's better in some way.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And we cannot go about this. And other people have gone about the quality issue with the data that we currently are using. We can't really speak to that. We have to abstract.
By the way, you promised Kim some cross industry product variations. Just curious, maybe that will help you to address some of the either quality variation. You can use a Rauch measure kind of thing to address what he thinks. And also you mentioned that there's some cross industry variation. Does that, like in terms of inventory holding costs?
Right. So in the robustness part of the inventory and trade data, we have we relax these fixed effects, and we see that these things tend to matter. And yeah, there is definitely some cross-industry variation, and I think I have that in some table in the appendix.
But I'm just trying to make sure. Sorry, maybe this got too detailed in the weeds. Like, what exactly are you proxy for? At the end of the day, like you have two variables. You have the inventory ratio. You also have the import penetration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
yeah, like it seems like if your argument is only is that true that given the import penetration ratio, the inventory ratio directly maps into the holding cost? Is that something that you are trying to ask us to think about?
Yeah. So in that EOQ model, you have that the average cost of materials is directly linked to the inventory usage ratio. So that's why we're putting in the inventory usage ratio. And then additionally, there's this, the cost of the good is weighted by the input intensity. And similarly, these ordering costs are larger. We think that they are larger for foreign sourcing. So somehow these ordering costs, if they are much more bigger for sourcing from abroad, the input intensity should kind of pick that up too.
Okay, I can see. I see that right.
Okay, good. So our next talk starts in 5 minutes. If anybody needs to run to the fridge or the restroom, Gisela, I think you can share your slides if you like, or at least get set up.
Hi, I think Rock has a question and he's muted.
Oh, I see. Hey, Rock.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can, yes.
I failed to unmute myself. The space bar was working and now it's not. So Armen, it's just a quick question. Imagine a firm starts importing and in doing so actually adopts better import management techniques. And I think Walmart will be an example. They seem just better at managing inventory at the distribution than other companies, perhaps by scale. At some level, actually, the fact that they get better at inventory management, that is a part of explanation of why they gain in productivity. There is a component of inventory that's specific to imports, which I guess is the one they want to capture, the one that is unavoidable. But their technology or productivity or TFPQ could also be a function of you are just better at inventory management, at the storage, at whatever. It's almost a little bit philosophical of where we put the distinction between a firm's ability to be better at a particular management versus just a feature of the product or imports in this case.
Yeah, no, I mean, there has to be some underlying production function of inventory management, and firms certainly will defer in that. And I will have to think in which direction things would go if the same firms that are importing more intensively are also have a more efficient inventory management, and if this is also endogenously responding to the switch towards those. I like that point.
I think in either way you're making a point, but perhaps then it's a lot less towards a bias of the elasticity and more towards in which channel these firms are gaining productivity.
Right.
Side.
Right.
Yeah. Not clear how to split those, honestly. But yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then there is this very strong relationship between size and the inventory usage ratio, which is also going to make it difficult to say what is coming through pure efficiency versus what is coming through the fact that now you're operating at a higher scale and you don't need to hold, you're basically ordering more frequently, but so you're also holding less inventories. So that distinction is kind of like what I see like going to make it. I guess we'd have some posts and structure.
I will say that there's a student at Rochester a couple of years ago who was looking into some of this, and she found that big firms don't actually get that much better at managing their inputs as you'd expect. And part of the reason why she was saying it is they start being more aggressive where they source inputs. And so it doesn't really look like, normally you'd expect the inventory sales ratio to fall with size. It doesn't fall strong enough with size. And it's because exactly this, they're kind of moving into like more inventory intensive inputs. So, but your point is exactly right. Like that's a type of technology, and that changes with size.